Welcome to Tartan Truths, and we are joined by the man himself, Peter MacDonald. Welcome back to Tartan Truths.
Thank you.
Great. So we have some exciting information this week. Um, Today's the 30th, May the 30th. Just yesterday, you posted a pretty fascinating article on your Facebook account talking about a tartan that you got to sort of analyze and look at. Why don't you talk to us a little bit about that? It's a beautiful red tartan.
I think earlier in the week I had a phone call from a lady, an Australian lady, saying, "Oh, I've been given your name. I've got this old plaid that's been in the family for 200 years. She brought it over from Australia about 3 years ago, tried to identify it, and couldn't. Went back again. Then she sent some photographs to someone else. Eventually, she brought it back again this year, trying to identify it, thinking, if I need to identify it, perhaps I ought to take it again. She went round various kilt shops. She'd looked in all the tartan books trying to identify this tartan. And one of the kilt shops, I think it probably Gordon said, "Oh, you need to speak to Peter MacDonald." So she gave me a call, and yesterday she drove over from Oban to bring this plaid, which was just an exquisite piece, a join plaid, probably about 1820, something like that. Why she'd not found it before is because it was a previously unrecorded tartan. Variation of a number of, or you can see elements of a number of different tartans in there, such as Drummond. And I'm in the process of writing a paper on the findings, which will be up on my website in a week or so.
So how often does that happen for you, where you come across something that's not really been identified at all?
So that happens not infrequently. I guess something like that turns up every couple of years if I'm lucky. Sometimes it's quite unusual that they come, if you like, un unannounced, as it were. More often, I'm searching down some rabbit hole trying to find something that I've heard about. But for people to come to me with pieces is a real joy because it's just making available again um, pieces that would otherwise have been lost.
So would this have been a custom project at the time, or would this have been something common, do you think?
Um, at the time, so this is really at the beginning of the concept of clan tartan. So it's not a clan tartan as we ever understand it. There was quite a lot of variation on a theme going on at that sort of time. Whether this was a custom piece or not, I've still a bit of research to do in this, but it looks like there were three plaids in the family and there were three brothers that emigrated. And I'm speculating now, but I wonder if it was a gift from the parents to each of the children to remind them where they came from or who they were, as it were.
Interesting. So some of the questions that you were asked on here, and I saw you gave a really nice close-up picture. Somebody wanted to know the type of stitching that was used, and you a tight whip stitch. So if people want to see that,
Yeah,
they can find that on your Facebook account.
yeah. And I've discussed it in a couple of the other papers, in one of my papers about how plaids were constructed, but it's the type of join or stitching used to join the two pieces.
Right. And not a miniaturized pattern I saw.
No, someone said that and I didn't quite understand it. And I think he was looking at one bit of the pattern and saying, "Oh, I can see other patterns in it." But he admitted himself he didn't really understand the technology. And once I explain it and I've written the paper, all that will become much clearer.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, so we look forward to that. Very cool find. Another great find on your Facebook account. I recommend people look for you on there. Is the Foundling Hospital tartan that's sort of talked about. I think it looks like April the 15th. You highlighted this. Is what a beautiful tartan this is.
Yeah, so that's a reconstruction that I did of two fragments, so putting them together and if you like, extrapolating the pattern from two pieces that were attached to a pair of twins, i.e., one to each twin, that were put into or taken into the Foundling Hospital, which was set up in London, and they were taken in 1758. Subsequently died, I think, at about a 1 year old each, and it's just one of these sad if you like, reminders that life at that period was quite hard. There are a lot of what they call these foundling tokens, but very few of them are textiles, and only one or two are tartan. And what's lovely about this, not only is it a lovely pattern, but that it shows the use of tartan outside Scotland at a time, well, first of all, when Highland dress was banned, but also when you had a lot of, still quite a lot of anti-Jacobite feeling. But it's that understanding that tartan was a textile pattern as well, that people are, were wearing it or using it for its beauty, irrespective of any clan, Highland, Scottish connection.
Someone brought out or asked the question on here, you know, this tartan needs to be revived. What are the odds that something like that could happen? I know you've been working on a lot of other things. Is
Yeah,
this one that
so
that could happen with?
It's absolutely possible. My view is, and I said it quite, firmly there, really to stop someone running off and doing it, is I believe that proprietarily this should belong to the Foundling Museum. I mean, it's still a charity, it still does good works. So if they wanted to reproduce this for the benefit and support of their charity, I think rightly it should belong to them. But yes, it is entirely possible to reconstruct it. And if I did it, I would sit down, and match the colours and the shades and the pattern and discuss that with them. So I'm hoping I have written to them and said, well, here it is. I give up all my rights to them in this respect because they made the photograph available, and so it's only right and proper.
So what are the odds that takes place?
I don't know. I wait and hear from them. It's the classic sort of thing that because they have, if you like, students, they might say, well, let's adopt it as some form of dress, as identification. We see it in a lot of other schools across the world. So, yeah, it's absolutely entirely possible. Next time I'm in London, I might drop in and see the Foundling Museum and just discuss it with them.
That's great. Okay, thanks for that extra insight. We'll put both this PDF where you talk about this particular Foundling Hospital tartan from ScottishTartans.co.uk. We'll put that in the show notes as well as the discussion we're about to have now with this regards to tartan color terminology, which we touched on in the last episode. And
Yep.
why do you think that that is such an important topic that we spend time with?
Because it's one of those things that's greatly misunderstood, I think, and particularly, there's no reason why people should necessarily understand the nuances of color, and because a tartan can look quite different depending on the palette, which is what we're talking about, that it's produced in, people can get confused and think that they're looking at different tartans, and that's very obviously the case in when you then get down to the, if you like, the reproduction and the muted ranges, etc. So what we have are arguably five, possibly now six or even seven color palettes. So we're looking at the same tartan, but because there is no standardized color in tartan, stand fast, you get some modern tartans that say, oh, it must be this shade of orange or whatever. Generally, we're using the term color to mean the generic um, color, i.e., red, blue, green, black, etc. And then we're talking about different shades. So is it light blue, dark blue, middle blue, or whatever? And therefore, the same tartan, if it's in dark colors, so think of the Black Watch tartan as people think of it today, very, very dark. Whereas if you said, oh, well, let's look at Campbell in ancient colors, it looks like a completely different tartan. It's
Yeah.
exactly the same tartan. So people get confused. So it's very important to understand, as I say, we've got old colors, modern colors. Sorry, let's start the other way around. We've got modern colors, so-called. Those are the very dark ones, which ironically are, in terms of commercialized patterns, probably the oldest surviving ones. So they, although you can get any shade with natural dyes from light to dark, this sort of standardized darker colors come in with the advent of aniline or artificial dyes from the mid 1850s onwards, when the dyes were quite harsh. About the turn of the 19th, 20th century, there was, if you like, a revival of what people thought, sometimes called the Celtic revival, when people went back to what they thought were the more traditional colours, and we had the introduction of what were called old or ancient colours, sometimes referred to as vegetable dye colours, which were purported to be more accurate to the old natural dyes. And I use that term advisedly, so natural dyes as opposed to vegetable dyes, because the principal source of red was cochineal, which is an animal dye, it's a beetle dye. So therefore, the term vegetable dye is incorrect.
Right. That's
Whereas,
a good
whereas
point.
some,
Good point.
yeah, some mineral dyes. So Persian lac was also used sometimes as well, but that you'll see that more in carpets, etc. Um, and so those are the two principal color or shades that we were working with commercially from, the really the early uh, 20th century when we start to see the formation of modern Highland dress and tartan as we understand it today. If you went back to Wilson's Bannockburn, who were the great tartan weavers of the late 18th and early 19th century, all of their tartans up to 1856 were all naturally dyed, and they had their own standardized palettes. They developed standardized color palettes by 1783. Um, and everything else is, if you like, an attempt to get back to something that looks like that. And almost every tartan, without exception, in my view, looks better if you do it in Wilson's as shades.
Hmm.
No commercial firm today is working with Wilson shades correctly. I do some of those as reconstructions, but they do require a special dye lot. You've got a couple of other colorways that you'll see, or palettes you'll see quite commonly. One is what we call muted shades, which, if you like, are a balance between old colors and modern colors. But again, like all shades, the issue I have with these is the commercial shades, is that there is a uniformity of shade across all the colors. So, they're all dark colors, they're all light colors, they're all medium tone colors. In the 18th century, early 19th century, when natural dyes were used, that's not how color palettes worked. What you would do is you would balance each of the colors against each other to produce something that was harmoniously more pleasing, if that makes sense. And that's not what we get today. Where we get that's really interesting is when you get to reproduction colors, which a lot of people will be familiar with, said to have been based on a piece that was dug up from Culloden. In fact, they are a manufacturer's invention from the late 1940s, DC Dalgleish Limited, now defunct. Um, they were also a proprietary or copyright color and terminology, but they became incredibly popular because they were quite subtle. If you like, I'll use the term muted, but they weren't muted colors. Um, and so other firms, the other big manufacturers, when they wanted to do something like that, they couldn't use that term because it was copyright. So they produced what they called weathered colors. What's interesting about reproduction, but particularly weathered colors, actually the colors change. So it could be argued that those are different tartans. So let's take the Gordon tartan, which is a blue, green, and black tartan with a yellow stripe in it. But if you put it into weathered colors, the green becomes brown and the blue becomes a sort of grey color. At that point, you're not talking about a shade difference, you're talking about a completely different color.
Hmm.
However, if we were to say or accept, because we know it's if you like the same clan or military tartan, same name, they're just putting it into a completely different colorway or color palette, if we were to accept that that was a separate tartan, then you would have to multiply the number of tartans that exist by at least times one, if not times two, if you included reproduction colours as well, which would take the number up to about 36,000, 40,000 tartans, which is just insane, because
Right.
we know where they came from.
Right. So it seems like, as you're kind of talking about this, it seems like the commercialism is what has really sort of dampened your appreciation for what's being done today. Is that a fair way of putting it?
Um, eh, yes, I wouldn't say it's dampened my appreciation. I guess it's what it is driven um, my interest and desire to keep alive and recreate, let's call it the original or the older style of patterns and colors and shades, because those are, if you like, our reference points from which everything else develops. And as I say, quite often, more often, and we're talking about, if you like, the traditional tartans as opposed to a new one like the Commonwealth Games tartan, which will be done in a particular set of shades and colors only for that event. But let's take, MacDonald or McPherson or whatever. All of those tartans look so much better, in my opinion, in their original colours. So the colours and shades of when they were designed in the late 18th century, um, and indeed some of the others which go back to the beginning or middle of the 18th century.
What's a
So it's
resource that people can go to find their tartan in the original form that it was, if it existed at that time? Is there a place they can go to find that? maybe
So
individually
that's
in the
really
book?
difficult because it depends on the tartan. I mean, I have photographed a number of collections of Wilson's patterns, for example,
Mhm.
and I'm trying to think if any of them are available. I think one set's available or will be available shortly on the Tartan Authority's webpage. But this is the problem that they either, well, some exist, some pieces we know about, but there are no original patterns surviving, but we know what cut. So let me give you an example. Um, hmm, Trying to think, not priest, because I've recently found priest, but there are a number of those early Wilson's patterns which we have a written record of them, but no known example.
Yeah,
But we have other examples that are contemporary that were in the same colours and shades, so we know what shades and colours were used, if that makes sense.
it
Um,
does.
but
Yeah.
there isn't a total case. It would be almost on an individual case by case basis. Some of the stuff that I write and publish, gives access to this, but Wilson's had, for example, had 300 odd patterns, mostly by number, but some by name. We are more likely to see it as some of the older tartans, so pre-Wilson, pre-18th century, pre-1800s tartans, which I have researched and published about, and I will include a photograph of the original specimen. So you can see them. And a classic one would be the MacDonald of Glencoe, so called. So it's produced commercially, but it is produced incorrectly, both in the layout of the pattern. There's some errors in it, and also the colours or the shades that it is produced in. But I've tracked down the original specimen, photographed it, and detailed it all and written a paper on it. So there is an example of where someone could do that.
Yeah, so let's say, for instance, so Wilson, the Book of Wilson's that they had, it laid out exactly how the tartan was supposed to be designed.
It is. And a lot of people say, oh, well, where can I get this book? So it was called the pattern book, but it was very much an in-house, record, if you like. So it was instructions to all of their weavers. This is, when you weave this pattern, this is how you set it out, and these are the colors to be used. But there weren't pictures or anything like that in it. They didn't include samples. But there are a number of commercial vendors, if you like, from that period who collated their own sample books of Wilson's patterns. So Wilson's would send them all the patterns. The the shop would then get them bound up so that they would have them as a reference point when customers came in.
Sure.
Exactly as the same as you would see today, but
Yep.
but they would have them personally. And I have tracked down, I think, 6, 7 surviving examples of those. Um, and what's fascinating is not no two of them have exactly the same patterns in them. You could say that probably 90% of the patterns are the same, but almost within all of them, if not all of them, there's one sample in there that's not in any of the others, which is great because without those, we wouldn't have a reference point for that tartan other than the thread count. But to actually see a piece is obviously the fantastic thing.
Of course. Why would the weaver not do it correctly then for a reproduction or sort of
Um,
to bring
okay,
it back
so
to
what
actual details?
happens quite often that this is from previous, I'll use the term researchers advisedly, from the 1950s and 60s, or even earlier, the 30s, who would perhaps go and look at a specimen, make a record that was a written record, not a photographic record, and this is, of course, the important thing. They would then go away and translate it and perhaps pass it on, and then their notes are found years later and they make various errors. And then you go to a weaver, and a weaver says, well, actually, these are our stock shades. So we'll use it says, let's say it says pink for one of a term. Well, this is the pink that we'll use. And it may be completely different from the original or the dark red, but that's the one we've got and we have. So we'll use that one. And you can see how, if you like, incrementally, the pattern changes because then they'll say, well, we need to fit the pattern to make a standard size set. So weavers now tend to produce about a 7-inch set as standard, which quite a lot of the older patterns were bigger. So they will then change the pattern in order to get a 7-inch set. Nothing wrong with that, but it actually removes it from the original point. If you're then saying with an historic tartan like the Glencoe, this is the original version or this is the correct recording, and it's not.
Right. So it's almost like it's almost like they lose track or lose perspective maybe over time.
Yeah,
They're
yeah,
building
yeah.
off what's in front of them instead of
Yeah,
what actually.
and some to say there was a book. printed in 1893, Old and Rare Scottish Tartans. Beautiful book with silk plates in it. And the author, who had worked for one of the largest weaving, um, gentlemen's outfitters in Edinburgh, he said that he used silk woven pieces because they gave a better representation than printing at that time, and that they were accurate in both color and arrangement, setting.
Got it.
And I've been through and I've looked. It's got 56 tartans, I think it is. I've been through and looked at all of them and gone back to the original source pieces where they still exist. And some of them are just woefully inaccurate.
Hmm.
An example would be the MacDonald of Kingsborough, which in his book has got a bright red, a very bright green with yellow overstripes. So when you go and see and there's only a small fragment that survives from the mid 18th century, and the red is a pinky red, the green is a dark green, and the yellow is actually a lighter mossy green. So completely gone. So perhaps he was colorblind. I know his son was colorblind, so it's entirely possible that this chap was colorblind as well. So that's where we have those issues. As I say, nowadays, when I'm going to look at a sample, so if it's in a private collection, or like yesterday, I will put a standardized color photographic card against the piece, and I will photograph it. So it doesn't matter, A, what my photographic lighting section is like. We've got that color reference point. And
Brilliant.
I will also take detailed pictures of the pattern with the card, which has then got a scale on it, so we can work out the thread count, know what density it was woven at, all of those things that were not available to previous researchers, really until the last 20 or 30 years, and digital photography, because it just allows one to do things that you can't do. We're sort of digressing slightly off the whole color terminology, but it's all, if you like, related. You've got color and pattern, and where does one stop and the other start, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's super important in sort of the understanding of this as a whole and seeing how it's sort of developed over the time that it has. You mentioned with regards to these sort of natural dyes and the things that they use for it. I mean, obviously that would create even sort of a it would sort of lack the standardization for a consistent color base, wouldn't it?
To some degree, and that is no different today.
Yeah.
Don't think that you can just dial it up and raw computer die today. So it does. So Wilson's at Bannockburn had developed standardized colors and patterns by the 1780s. Yes, there was some variation in them because you would always get variation, although they were working, if you like, in large amounts, so you can standardize to some degree. The quality of the dye stuff source may change, and you may have faults in the dyeing. They used to get lots of complaints about their green and their yellows fading. That was the other thing. Um, it's only in doing some work with one of the modern weavers who have their own dye house, the Loch Carron, and talking to them, did I understand that even today there are problems with dyeing, so that if I historically want to dye red, for example, I would go to cochineal and then I would change the shade or even the color I got depending on what fixative I used to bind the color, extract the color and bind it. It's quite similar today, so that, if you go to the pot that says red dye, actually that will be composed of elements of, if, let's say, blue, green, yellow, black, whatever, that have made up that red. And that dye stuff, modern dye stuff, will take differently on a different material, so silk or wool, but then even different fleeces will give you a different color, or sorry, different shade. There will be, so not different color, different shade. So if it was a crossbred worsted, you might get a slightly different shade of red to, let's say, a merino wool fleece. But even a merino fleece that is grown in a very dry year, the dye will take differently to if it was in a very wet year or it was a poor fleece or something like that. So there are all these things that affect or can affect the actual shades that you get. And that's even today. Then you get the fact that over time, certain chemicals get banned. The classic one would be chrome. Chrome was used to give a really good strong black, a sort
Hmm.
of jet black that you don't actually get with natural dyes, but that's become outlawed because it's so pernicious, so poisonous, the waste of it is. So when you take that element out, A, you weavers say they can't get as good a jet black as they used to get 40 or 50 years ago, but also they then have to replace that chrome with some other chemical source to add into the black. But once you add that in, it then changes the whole recipe and they have to start tweaking everything else. So suffice to say that, even different dye lots and different manufacturers, it may vary today, which might surprise people because you'd think with computerization, etc., you just dial in this recipe and hey ho, it would be the same all the time. And
Yeah.
that's what I had thought until fairly recently, and it was a really good um, eye opener, if you like, for me, looking at um, the restrictions even on modern dyeing techniques. So
Yeah.
yes, they changed in the past, and they were standardized, but there would have been variation, no different today.
Yeah, that's a good point. So you have certainly your favorites as far as who does it a certain way, some of the different weavers. I found it interesting in your section on the modern and ordinary colors,
Hmm.
just on this very topic, actually, about the Ministry of Defense still specifying exact shades of colors to be used in their tartans,
Yep,
to
yep,
maintain that myth of their dark origins in the face
yep,
of extant specimens in the early
yep.
19th century.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that will present, that difficulty for the weavers because, what the Ministry of Defence were using, or probably the War Department were using, let's say in 1914, or the supplier will have used to make blue, green, and black, will be different dye stuffs today. So they'll have to tweak them to make something that looks approximate. And so that changes.
Yeah, that's crazy. So, I guess going back then, I'm not trying to pin you down or anything like that, but I guess so. Just to be clear, then, so there are certain of the major weaving companies that you prefer specifically for any particular tartan or tartans in general.
So there are two things there. One is to do with, if you like, weight, and I generally prefer, it depends what it's for, but I generally prefer to work with what we now call heavyweight, so about a 16 ounce. So there are two or three weavers that will do that. Um, I quite like, so my preferred weaver personally for a lot of the projects I'm involved with has been Loch Carron, um, and that's partly because they have their own dye house.
Okay.
They're the only weavers that still do, and so therefore their ability to meet the requirements of matching patterns is, superb. Really, really good. I mean, I've done a recent project, the Genesis project with House of Edgar. That's been fantastic, and the results are fantastic. But it's a different, we're talking apples and pears there,
Right.
quite different in what's been achieved. Um, so it depends what project I'm working on, um, as to which of those two. But there are two or three of the large weavers that I will generally deal with. I'm dealing with House of Edgar with my STA hat on with another project at the moment, which I can't mention, but will be public fairly soon.
Okay.
Um, and again, I've done a lot of work with as I say, Loch Carron and a couple of the smaller weavers as well, Andrew Elliott Limited, etc. But if in terms of um, breadth and availability, my go-to generally is Loch Carron because of that dye capability.
Yeah, that's
No
fantastic. So
one, no one else can do that.
yeah. So you could actually, if you did your research and you said, "Hey, La Karen, I've been digging into this, and it turns out that this color that you're putting forward, it actually needs to be a little lighter." Would that be something that could happen where they could change that for?
They might. So if it was a stock tartan, they might not do. They probably wouldn't do that because whatever version they produced is what their customers expect. So it would
Okay.
be quite a volt fast for them to change. But where it
Sure.
works is on some of the reconstruction work. So I did last year, I think, what I call the MacDonald 1820. So it was a piece of standard MacDonald tartan, Clandonald tartan, but I had access to a piece from about 1820, a piece of Wilson's of Bannockburn. Took it down there and we worked together to produce, I would say, an exact, a, a 99.999% accurate copy, not only in the colors and shades, sorry, the shades, but also the size of the set, etc. And when you lay the original piece on top of the reconstructed cloth, it's a fabulous match. And that was a case of, so the black in the original had a slightly brownish hue to it
Hmm.
because I said you can't get a jet black from natural dyes. So blacks are always, if you like, a grey black, charcoaly black, or a browny black, or a bluey black, but some influence on there, so it had a slight browny tone. When you looked at the actual single color that was used to put into the tartan, it was a brown, a
Hmm.
very subtle brown with a sort of lot of grey, towards the black. But if you stood it and looked at it on its own right, it was brown. But once it's woven up, it's black because it's how it then interacts with the other colours. And as I say, a superb match to the original piece. So, a wonderful project there.
Yeah, that's great. And this will probably just keep happening. I mean, as more things are uncovered, people dig out their closets, they find something that's not been sort of
Yeah.
revealed. I mean,
And this is where um, there's a aspiration expectation. That's where that meets the reality of finance. So these projects that I've done with Loch Carron, I have undertaken myself. I have funded the runs that support this, and it's not a cheap process.
hmm,
But on the belief, understanding that I would be able to sell if I do something as a limited run, but it is still quite a limited run. We're looking at, 200 or 300 meters of cloth, which is quite an outlay. You can't just say, I've got a small piece, I'd like a kilt and I'd like it managed. Not going to
right,
happen.
right.
Not going to happen unless they've got those stock colors. And
Hmm.
someone will say, okay, I'll do, and it depends which weaver will do it. But if you have an old tartan, it is very unlikely that there will be all the shades to match, and so they will have to be dyed. And this is exactly what we found with matching, with House of Edgar. So projects I did with them is the Genesis collection. One of the and there were six tartans in that. I think my favourite is probably the MacDonald of Borrowdale, because the original had errors. It had an idiosyncrasy in the way that it was warped in the black section, and they must have used two different dye lots. But instead of just using some till it ran out, they actually um, wove or prepared the yarns in the warp, the long waist threads, using the two different shades, so that they are alternatively, let's say, black, greyish black, black greyish black, black, but not quite in that complete order. Anyway, House of Edgar sat down and produced that accurately as a reconstruction, and it looks superb. Just that little feature running through it just has such a subtle but beautiful element to it. And again, that's where, Weaver said, here's a project we'd like to be involved with, and it's a really neat, unique aspect to an old pattern. Let's, replicate that, keep it alive for this particular tartan run. So doing things like that, really rewarding. And as I say, keep us linked into how things were done in the past, rather than the run-of-the-mill stuff.
Yeah. And
With
running
all
those
of these
stuff's not
things,
as fun.
there's always a higher cost, but what price, anything that's worth doing and that's well, I say unique, it's just, like anything else that's a small run, it's going to be slightly more expensive,
Yeah.
but you get what you pay for, I guess, at the end of the day.
That's fair. That's a fair way of putting it. So going back in back to your article and staying kind of on this point, I guess,
Yeah.
muted colors. Let's
Yep.
talk about the muted colors. Your perspective is that those are actually probably closer to overall
They're
what it is.
overall, so muted colours, and that was, I think I'm right in saying that was a colour palette that was originally brought in by House of Edgar. It sits there somewhere between old colours and modern colours. It is closer generally to natural dyes of, say, Wilson's of Bannockburn, etc. They're not exactly right. So, for example, the green's really quite good. I find the blue a bit too petrol-y, too bright blue. It's not quite right when you compare with what was done in the 18th, early 19th centuries, and the red tends to be a bit too dark, in my opinion. And this is the whole thing of how whether you're trying to recreate the old ones or whether you're just using a color palette that has a pleasing and commercially viable output. Because there's no point in doing something that no one wants.
Right.
I mean, I would love to see one of the weavers say, right, we're going to just do a whole range in Wilson's of Bannockburn shades, because they were the first standardized shades, and every pattern, in my opinion, looks better in those shades. But
I'm
so
surprised that
far,
hasn't happened.
so far, I don't know. Perhaps because, they've all developed their various shades. So let's say muted shades, they already produce those. So why going to do something that's similar but not quite? Um, So I guess someone's not just seen the market potential for that. If you were going to do that, you'd probably then, if you like, retrofit them to go back to the older original settings of all the patterns as well. So you get things that look potentially quite different to the ones that we're now seeing, probably much bigger patterns.
So yeah, I mean, I guess that's like, kind of all goes back to the commercialism, sadly.
Yeah.
So the muted, even the muted ones, it's like they weren't really trying to get it historically accurate, but
No,
that
there
did
was
speak.
if you like, a leaning or a reference towards that.
Yeah,
And I wasn't involved with it, so I don't know, the thought process behind it. But clearly there was a niche there that they went for, and I don't know whether it was at the same point they produced their old and rare collection, they being House of Edgar, but it sort of ties in with a lot of those ones as well. So they are towards that thing, but they're not wholly accurate as
right.
in terms of a reconstruction or a representation of some of the older patterns.
But like you said, they don't want to make something that maybe is historically accurate, but that isn't very pleasing to the eye. So they want to make sure that
Well,
they get
there is that. Yeah, and it's interesting because again, people's color preferences or shades change. So a bright red, scarlet red, was very popular in the 18th and early 19th centuries because you couldn't just get it out of a tin. It was therefore the more expensive color, therefore it had kudos. But because you can just go and buy it now, nobody values it in the same way, and they want a duller red, more like a sort of cherry red, because that's more pleasing and more subtle, if you like. But that's not what people wanted in the past, in a time when most clothing was very drab. If you live your lives in blacks and browns and greys, you might want a nice bright red.
Good point. It's a great illustration you have in that PDF file, with the Cameron. You have the modern colors and then the muted colors, and it's a striking variation.
Yeah.
So, with regards to the natural dyes, what were some of the limitations that maybe the early dyers would have had then as they're trying to produce what it is that they're trying to make?
Well, take this the other way. So the concept of natural dyes is another one of those leads to another one of those great tartan myths. That being that, every area, people say, oh, there weren't clan tartans, but each the district had their own tartan, and that was based on the number, what plants they could grow in that area. With one or two or few exceptions, there are very few traditional dyestuffs that are location specific in Scotland. It's a small country. Most plants grow everywhere.
Yeah,
Few lichens on the west coast, etc. So that doesn't work if you like. The restrictions, I guess, were availability, um, and that then was also, you only use dyestuffs that are as fast as you can make them, I light fast, wash fast, etc., rather than being speedy, um, because you don't want to spend all that time producing something that's going to fade out, next week.
right.
So there's the dyestuffs, what colours you were wanting to achieve. Red, as I say, red's certainly by the 18th century, red was being imported, or the red dye stuff, which was cochineal principally. Um, there are natural indigenous reds available, but they are harder to use, and you don't get the same quality of reds, particularly the scarlets, etc. Um, so you would have seen far less red in the past, and it would have probably been more associated with high status pieces. Similarly, blue, being imported as a blues from indigo, that was imported into Scotland from 1600. Our earlier dye stuff was woad, not the stuff that you paint on your face because it doesn't go blue unless you dip yourself in a hot dye bath first. Um, that it's the same dye stuff chemically, so you can't tell the difference whether something's dyed with woad or indigo, other than possibly the depth of the shade, because you don't have the same intensity with indigenous indigo. The stuff that's imported, or indigotin, I should say, the stuff that's imported tends to come from India or in the 19th century from the Carolinas, Georgia, places like that, where it's nice and hot and you could grow this particular species or subspecies. So you were constrained by, like all these things and like any culture, what you could afford was available, and indeed what you liked. And it would have always been the case, as with clothing, that the rich would have had the best. The They weren't middle classes, but if you like, the next ranks down would have always aspired to be the rich. and the poor people will have just made do with whatever they wanted or
Mm.
could get. And it's invariably the case that in rural areas, that the poor people would have used much more local dye stuffs, but again, as I say, things that were as fast as they could make them. Um, Something like blue, woad, as I say, although it's indigenous, again, we were importing it because we were using so much of it. We've been importing it from Holland from the 1400s, and madder to some degree as well for reds. Great thing about those is you don't need a lot of the dye stuff, a lot of an indigotin to dye blue, depending on how much you want. So it's quite versatile. Blue then gives you access to green because you combine blue and any yellow, and you'll get a green. So there were those colors. So it's more likely that, let's say, common people would have been wearing more blue, green, brown, yellow-based type tartans. And what we think of now, and you see many people wearing red-based tartans, would have been more the preserve of the rich and powerful. And this is certainly what you see in portraiture and indeed surviving specimens, because, of course, almost all the surviving specimens from the pre-1800, or certainly pre-1750-ish, are generally finer pieces than those that we would therefore associate with the gentry, because they could afford more than one set of clothing, they could keep stuff spare, it would survive. No different than any other culture in sort of the Western European hemisphere. Poor people wore things until they fell apart.
Yeah. Yep.
So it doesn't survive. The rare exception, well, I was about to say, is the Glenafric tartan, but that's not, because the quality of this spinning suggests that that was a high status piece, albeit it was a much relatively duller piece. Um, but again, we're talking about dye stuff availability in the 16th century rather than the 18th century.
Right. So we're basically we see a lot of times in these the sort of the olive greens and the blues combination. That's
Yeah,
pretty regular, right? In most.
it is. So we talked earlier about modern colors, and the classic one there, the thing about those is they're very, very dark.
Yeah.
Surviving 18th century pieces of tartan, generally the greens are a what I would call, to use the French, a goose shit green,
Mm.
much more a sort of mossy green, something like that. You tend not to get a very dark bluey green. There are a couple of exceptions that survive. Classic one would be the specimen that was sent to Lord Loudon for his regiment in 1745-6, which is a very, very dark colour, like we would think of as modern colours, but it's mid-18th century. That's an exception. Generally, and if as a dyer, how I do start, is you take your most expensive colour, invariably the red, you dye with that and get the best shade that you can out of that, and then you balance your other colours around that. If you look at old specimens, red was any color, any shade rather, from a scarlet right through to a pink, and any shade of pink, because it depends on the quality, the amount of dye stuff, and how you fix it. Blues were generally a mid to a dark navy. And then the greens usually were a more subtle mossy color, and that therefore gave a balance to the pattern rather than them being uniformly all dark or uniformly all light. And I guess that's the thing that I dislike about modern palettes of any of the weavers. And I know why they do it, it's commercialization. They just say, here's this range, here's that range, it's easier to sell. But their intrinsic, I feel it loses the intrinsic beauty of a lot of these tartans by that uniformity of shade across all the colors.
Yeah. That's fascinating. So as we kind of think about all these different types of tartan, we talked about the ancient, the modern, the weathered, the muted, the reproductions. Do you think that by having all this range of colors, that we're doing something to preserve the real heritage, or are we doing something that's actually muddying the waters of what was truly the tartan?
But I think there's a sort of halfway house between that. It helps preserve the heritage because it engenders more interest and therefore more questions, and therefore it's up to those of us that know and understand to make it clear um, how these all relate to each other and what the reference point in history is, if you like, so that people have that anchor into the past. So for me, that's this important bit about you explain all the colours. So old colours doesn't mean it's an old tartan. Modern colours doesn't mean it's a modern tartan. So you can get an old tartan in modern colours, just to confuse, or indeed a modern tartan in old colours. And we then sort of touch on nomenclature, and certainly through my work with the Scottish Tartans Authority and its predecessor, the Scottish Tartan Society, we tried to get an agreement through the principal manufacturers that they would use standard terminology.
Yeah, we talked about that in the last episode.
Yeah, absolutely, which unfortunately they haven't.
Right.
So, but what our recommendation was that anything that referred to the colour stroke palette came after the name. So MacDonald, modern, old, ancient, or whatever. But if there were two MacDonald tartans, and there are more, but if there were two MacDonald tartans, the older one, you would then have, old MacDonald, who has a farm, or ancient MacDonald, or something like that,
Uh-huh.
to differentiate them between. In the records that I keep for the Tartans Authority, I prefer where there are just dozens of McDonald tartans. I prefer to put where I know them, the ages against the tartans, so that I've got a reference point in, if you like, development and historical thing. I find that much more easier to work with and a better way of codifying them, etc.
Yeah, that's a brilliant way of doing it, actually. I think all the weavers should follow that example and do that.
Yeah, yeah, but they need to, yeah, yes, I need to then produce it all first. But certainly that's how I have done it, and it makes much more sense where you've got that, and particularly you've got lots of different trade versions. You go, this is the classic, this is the Gordon as produced in 1800, and here's the version in 1880, and here's the 1927 version, where they can be quite different to look at, and it's to do with proportions, or has someone then added a black stripe to the edge of the yellow or something like that? When did that occur? And giving it different names, yeah, okay. But if you put the age in, people go, oh, so that's the oldest one, and this is, a more modern one. Why is that? And again, it starts that conversation.
Yeah, it does start that conversation, but it would simplify the discussion so much if you had it
Wouldn't it just? But that's far too logical.
far too logical.
And with all of these, so even across the manufacturers, they won't necessarily all use the same nomenclature or name for each of the tartans. So some will just call them slightly, different things, and which doesn't help. Let alone then all adopting this version. So I suspect a bit like them changing some of their colours. So old colours from one manufacturer's will look different to someone else's because that's the palette of old colours that they've always used. You won't get a standardization.
Right. I think that's how I
And
even
that's the
come
other, sorry,
across.
that's the other important thing for people to understand that all colours, whilst it's a term that refers to a lighter palette, Weaver A's lighter palette will differ from Weaver B's, which will differ from Weaver C's, and that's the same across all the palettes. They're not different colours, and most importantly, they are not different patterns.
Right.
That takes us back to the starting point. And I go to various games, have been to various games in the past, and someone will come up to you and say, "Oh, we've got five tartans. We've got the old one, the modern one, and the very nice pale washed out one. You know, they're all the same." And they look at you with this blank confusion until, and what you have to do is get something that has, if you can, get specimens of the same tartan in the same size set and lay them against each other and say, look, that's red, that's red, that's red, that's red, because there's no, when I say to you red, what shade of red? Oh, well, you know, the way I talk to people, and it's not in, they sort of get it, say, whatever car you've got, let's say you've got a Ford, whatever. If I go and it's red, if I go and paint it a different shade of red, it is still a Ford.
Yes.
It's
Correct.
not exactly the correct analogy, because if I go and paint it green, it's still a Ford. But they sort of get the idea that, whether it's light green, dark green, it's still the same thing.
Yep. So let's just say then, because a lot of the people that are buying tartan sometimes they don't do this in-depth research. But let's say somebody comes to you and says, I want my traditional tartan. What is Peter MacDonald's go-to advice for balancing the historical accuracy with modern availability?
Well, so the first thing is do your research. And if it is let's say, a common or a standard tartan, Most of the manufacturers will do it, and therefore there will be a range of versions of it available, both in palette and also size. So go and look at the ones that you like, because I'm not going to tell you this is right if you don't like it. And then whichever one you pick, just understand, if you like, the background behind it. If you're that, I mean, if people have gone to that level, then they'll be interested in that level of thing. If they want to go for the earliest representation, there's probably a discussion to be had individually because it will depend on availability, etc. Or do they want to go for a custom weave? Most of the big manufacturers will do 10 meters. It will cost you more money, but actually, if you want to get back to accurate stuff, and then you can start about, looking at other things, changing the set size, adding a herringbone selvage, all sorts of things like that, if you're going to a small customized run. And those things are possible. And this, I guess, is one of my other pleas. And you see it a lot, especially in America, dare I say it. People wanting, the sort of more stuff, and therefore they buy cheap stuff. Well, if you buy, you won't get history cheaply. It doesn't work like that. So by all means have, 3, 4, 27 kilts or whatever. But if you want one go-to, the standard, the historical reference point to you, spend the time, do your research, and buy the best that you can afford stroke is available,
Yeah,
because that's the thing that is the link to your heritage.
excellent. Peter, we appreciate your time again this week,
My
and
pleasure.
it's been fun, and we look forward to the next episode.
Excellent. Good. We look forward to catching up next time.